We've been looking at Acts for quite a while. In fact, we're almost done. Next week we are finished with the book of Acts, and I think I mentioned it last week. Y'all may not realize it, but we really started this study like 2 years ago. Not Acts, but remember we started back in Genesis. And we said we were going to look at the narrative story of the Bible. And we weren't going to look at prophets, and we weren't going to look at laws, and we weren't going to look at letters and poetry. And so we are looking at the narrative. And we started with Genesis. And we went through the Old Testament, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, to finish the Old Testament, and then we went to the Gospel of Luke and looked at Luke. And the reason we looked at Luke and not one of the others is because Luke includes, or the second volume of Luke's work is Acts. And so when we finish Acts, we have done the biblical narrative from Genesis all the way through Acts. So you know the Bible's story, and that's why next week there'll be a test of everything we've covered since Genesis 1:1, so you have now time to prepare. And it's not a test that I'm giving, it's a test that... So, anyway, I think that's pretty good that we've gone through that narrative. Now, it seems to me we've looked at we've been dealing with Paul for such a while, and looking at some of the places he's gone. So I thought it might be interesting to consider some of his letters. And I thought we might start with the Corinthian letters, because we've already looked at Romans, which is kind of the defining letter of Paul. But we'll look at the Corinthians letters and then see what we want to do after that. So that's it. Now we've been in the book of Acts, and like I said, Acts, and you know that Luke and Acts is one book, 2 volumes, but one book, because it's the same author, and it's one of those few things that have an articulated author among the Gospels. That's kind of unique. And so Luke has a pattern in Luke Acts, that if you look at the ministry of Jesus, once he starts, doing his work, the flow of Luke is Jesus moving toward what city? You remember when Jesus has a pivotal moment in Acts, in Luke, where Luke writes, Jesus set his face toward Jerusalem. And if you look at the book of the Gospel of Luke, the whole ministry of Jesus flows to Jerusalem, and things he does along the way. Now understand that's different than the flow in John, because Jesus goes to Jerusalem 3 times in his adult life in John, but for Luke it's only once. So the work flows from Galilee to Jerusalem. And what happens to Jesus in Jerusalem? They crucify him. What happens to what else happens to him? He's risen. What else happens? He ascends. And all the appearances of Jesus are in and around Jerusalem. The furthest he gets away from Jerusalem is the Emmaus Road, which is going to Jerusalem. So everything happens in and around Jerusalem. There's no mountain in Galilee, like in Matthew. There's no beside the Sea of Galilee, like in John. Everything happens. So we have the crucifixion, the resurrection, all the appearances, the ascension, which is also unique to Luke, the ascension. And then what happens in Jerusalem? So Jerusalem is like this hub. Everything in Luke flows to this city. All the important things happen here. And then we get Acts, and he kind of covers the same material in Luke 24. He covers in Acts 1, really similar. What happens in Acts? Right at the beginning of Acts.
They're sent out.
Okay, boom, they're sent out, right? And where, according to Jesus, because remember he's with them 40 days and gives them, in 40 days, Luke says Jesus gave them 2 commands. Don't worry about when I'm coming back. Don't worry about that. Instead, share, be my witnesses. Where does that start? Jerusalem. Then Judea and Samaria, then the ends of the earth. So you got this neat pattern that I think Luke establishes as he tells his story. And remember, he's telling this story to a church that has very specific needs, facing very specific issues, and Luke is conveying to them, not like a reporter giving an impartial presentation, but he's sharing with them euangelion. He's sharing with them good news. Why is this Jesus the one that is like a guy that runs to your city and says, our army just won the battle, we're not going to go under siege, which is what euangelion means. How is Jesus like that? I mean, that's what all the gospel writers are doing. So it's not impartial reporters taking notes. It's telling the story about why Jesus is important. So we get this flow to Jerusalem, and then Jesus says the gospel is going to have to flow out from Jerusalem. So that's called, if you have done any work with English, like poetry and stuff, that's called a chiasm, where you flow to a center. You flow to it, and then you flow from it. And that's what we've got in Luke Acts, which is kind of a neat little pattern as he's telling his story. Something the reader might pick up on as he's telling his story. Other reasons why Matthew, Jesus is on a mountain in Galilee or by the seashore. They're working on telling their story in different ways. So this is what Luke is doing. And as we did the first part, so it starts, before it can even begin though, before the gospel can be shared in Jerusalem, what needs to happen? The Holy Spirit has got to be on the people doing it, because something else we saw it throughout Acts. Something else we see is, as the word is being shared, the disciples and the apostles, particularly the apostles, are going to do the same thing that Jesus did during his ministry. So if Jesus taught, the apostles will teach. If Jesus preached, preach. Healing. The only difference is when you compare what Jesus did with what the apostles do, how do those things compare? How would the miracles of Jesus, the healings of Jesus, compare to the healings of the apostles in Acts? Now, we would probably assume that the healings of Jesus would be superior, more spectacular. But that's not the case. Yeah, the apostles raised the dead. And in fact, remember, when Peter is walking down the street in Jerusalem, what are people doing? They don't even need to touch him. They're bringing people out so that his shadow touches them. So Jesus touched. The apostles don't even need to touch. Their shadow heals. Now, remember, Jesus is conveying this to a church, right? What is he telling that church? They can do it too. Don't sit there and think, oh gosh, if we could go back to the way it used to be, oh, it was so wonderful then, and Jesus was doing all this. Look at us, we can't do anything. Luke is telling them, you're crazy. Don't you realize you can do things greater than Jesus did? Not saying that you're a son of God, but you got power. And the power rests on the Holy Spirit, which rests on the disciples, and it also rested on Jesus when he was baptized. So the same Spirit that rested on Jesus rests on the apostles, rests on the church. And therefore the church can do great, great things. And where does the mission start? Jerusalem. And as Luke is conveying this, because I think he's communicating this to a church that's really struggling somewhere around 90 AD, that's really facing hard times. expected Jesus to come back, and he hadn't come back yet. And so they're getting kind of disappointed, and they may not be growing that great, and, things are tough. He's telling them, not only do you have the Spirit and you can do great work, but you can use these people, the beginning of the church, as an example. And as they do their work, what kind of success do they see, the apostles? Are they successful in their ministry? Lord have mercy. When one of them preaches a sermon, what's the result? Thousands of people. It's not like, a couple of people joined us, which would make me feel pretty good. But they're talking about thousands of converts. So Luke is telling history, not, I don't think, to discourage them, but to encourage them. If they can do that, then, since the same Spirit rests on you, man, it's time for you to get up, stop moaning and groaning and complaining about things, and start doing what the Spirit empowers you to do. So they do it in Jerusalem. Peter seems to be the focus of the work in Jerusalem. Hugely successful. It expands. Philip takes the gospel where? Judea and Samaria, the Ethiopian eunuch, and takes the gospel there, Philip the evangelist. And then then the next step, once that's accomplished, the next step is ends of the earth. And who is going to take it to the ends of the earth? Paul's going to take it to the ends of the earth. And what is Paul's background? Is he a likely communicator of the gospel? Heck no. He's unlikely, because his whole background is. Although Luke is very careful that when Stephen was stoned, Paul didn't throw a rock. He held the coat. So Paul may have brought accusations against Christians, but he didn't swing the axe. He didn't throw the rock. Because being a persecutor is one thing, being a murderer would be something else. So, but Paul, his conversion is miraculous. In fact, as Paul begins, we've got some of these issues that have to be addressed if the gospel is going to the ends of the earth. Like, what's the big issue that's going to have to be addressed? If the gospel is going to go beyond Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, as it's being shared, to whom are you going to be talking? You're going to be talking to Jews, but you're also going to be talking to Gentiles, right? In Jerusalem, you're going to be talking primarily to Jews. Judea, primarily Jews. When you get to the ends of the earth, you may go to synagogues, but there's a lot of people there that are not Jews. So you got to figure out what's going to happen with the Gentiles, which they all those issues they solve. The big one being circumcision. And circumcision becomes, this example, but it really points to something bigger. Is the gospel just for Jews? Is the gospel of Jesus Christ, the good news, is it for Jews? And we get the answer, and the answer is no. And who gives us that answer? God does. Good. What story do you remember the story where God gives us that answer? That the gospel can actually go to non-Jews, can go to Gentiles? Peter, yes! And Cornelius, and he's led and he sees the sheep and nothing's unclean, and, you can go and talk to Cornelius, which he does, and Cornelius, as Paul is in mid-sentence, or Peter's in mid-sentence, what happens to Cornelius and his household? Spirit, boom, comes, and Peter says, Lord, have mercy. I can't withhold baptism when clearly God has chosen these folks. So, bang, the gospel can go out to Gentiles. But we still have an issue, right? Even though the gospel can go out to Gentiles, Gentiles can hear the word, Gentiles can change. And we got Paul, the one that's going to do it. But we still have an issue. And what's the issue? That, by the way, is going to be resolved.
Language.
Well, now we've got the problem. You don't have to be a Jew to hear the word or to believe. You can be a Gentile and believe. The question is, after you believe,
Do you have to become a Jew?
do you have to become a Jew? Do you have to become a Jew? Which means, again, with circumcision as sort of that, the thing that Luke pulls out, and because Jews would see that as sort of the defining law, but it really reflects other laws too. Do Gentiles then have to become Jews after they become Christians? Therefore, do they need to be circumcised? And that becomes a big issue. And we know it's an issue even as we read Paul's letters. It was an issue in the early days of the church. Does the church resolve it? Of course they do. They have a great big meeting, right? And again, the last time we heard Peter, he stands up at that meeting and says, let me tell you what happened with me. And Peter sways, James is leading it, and they say, no, Gentiles don't need to be circumcised after they become Christians. But there's an asterisk. Remember, there's the asterisk.
They have to follow rules.
They have to follow 4 rules, 3 of which are dietary. You have to, which again, I told you, one of the things I believe is that Luke is the most profoundly Jewish of the Gospels, or the Gospel writers. That you don't see anything in Paul where Paul says, but guys, you got to obey some dietary laws. In fact, in Romans, he kind of says you can eat meat offered to idols because idols don't represent anything. Therefore, eating meat offered to idols is just meat. It doesn't mean anything. But according to Acts, would Paul have said that? I know, because Paul endorses those 4 rules that you got to follow. This is the story Luke is telling. You also, not only do you see the church resolving these issues, they're in harmony. This church is this harmonious group. You don't have major divisions inside the church. You don't have anything like we'll see in the Corinthian letters, in the book of Acts. You don't see the controversy that's happening in the early Christian church as they try to figure out what it means to follow Jesus. Okay.
What were the 4 rules? The 3 were dietary.
You remember does anybody remember the 4 rules? One was really broad and had to do with sexual morality. Okay. And I mean really broad. And that was the first. And then, you remember what it was? You remember the others?
Don't eat foods offered to idols.
You don't eat food that's been offered to idols. You can't eat food. You can't eat meat with blood in it. You can't eat meat with blood in it. And remember, Jews believed that blood, the Spirit of God was in the blood. Was in the blood. The Spirit that God gives. I said Spirit of God. That's the Spirit that God gives us and enables us to live, be animated, is in the blood. Of all things, not just humans. Of all things, possess this animating spirit. So when you eat the blood of anything, you're kind of attempting to consume the Spirit of God, the Spirit that God gives us to live. And so the blood needs to be drained. You have to be kosher. And that was you remember the other one. So we've got, you can't eat meat offered to idols. You can't eat meat with blood in it. And you can't eat.
Is that with the hoofs or the...
No, didn't have anything to do with hoofs. You can't eat carrion. You can't eat animals that have already been killed, that you find dead. Those were the laws. The 4 laws that, and remember after the meeting, everybody agrees. And when Paul takes it to these Gentile churches, they all agree. Nobody disagrees with these 4 rules. Luke wants, not only is this a church with power, it's a church where everybody gets along. Lord have mercy. They're sharing everything. People are bringing that stuff to church and distributing it based on need. This is an incredibly harmonious community that God has created. Luke is telling his church, This is your example. You can do this. They did it. You can do it. Okay, Paul's taking his message out right to the ends of the earth. He's going to all kinds of different places. We're looking at it. He deals with different people in different ways. You know, one of the significant ones is how he deals with the people in Athens. And he preaches them a sermon. The only sermon really in Luke and Acts that's different. You know, there's a little unique because he doesn't mention Jesus in his sermon to the Athenians. He talks about the God of creation, which they can understand, which I think is Luke telling his congregation, you know, you got to know your audience. You know, you can't talk about fulfilling prophecy to an audience where people don't know about prophecy and don't care about prophecy. That's not what you do. You don't try to teach them so that they do care. If you're presenting the good news, you do it in a way that's going to resonate with them. That's a powerful sermon. Now, what's Paul's situation right now? So he's been doing this, the gospel is going, but it hasn't gone to the center of the world yet.
Right.
It hasn't got to Rome. And if it's going to the ends of the earth, it's got to go to Rome. All roads lead to Rome. All roads lead from Rome. It's got to be in Rome, and he hasn't gotten there. He's gone to Greece, but he hasn't gotten to Rome. What has happened to Paul recently?
He's in prison.
What's that?
He was in prison.
Okay, he's a prisoner. He's a prisoner in a kind of an odd way, right?
He has free will.
Yeah, he's got free. He can do pretty much what he wants to do. It's almost like he is a prisoner, but it's almost like protective custody, because the Romans are holding him. But by holding him, the Romans are actually doing what?
Keeping him safe.
Keeping him safe. They're protecting him. Which again, I think that's a message Luke is conveying to his church. You know, don't be afraid of the Romans. Be afraid of the Jewish leaders who are what? Jealous. They want to kill him, and they want to kill him because they're jealous. That's what Luke tells us. So don't be afraid of the Romans. The Romans are not believers, but the Romans are fair. The Romans are fair. They believe in justice. So if you're in trouble, you may not get sympathy, but you're going to get a fair hearing from a Roman. You're not going to get a fair hearing from people who are jealous of you. They aren't going to give you a fair hearing. Okay, so so Paul is in Roman custody. He was first in Jerusalem and says on trumped up charges. Now he went to Caesarea. And what happened to him in Caesarea? The Romans have him. The Jewish leaders warn him they're going to kill him if the Romans let him go, because they've already plotted behind the scenes. What does Paul say when he's being held in? Because the Romans are very sympathetic to his situation. They don't believe he's guilty. You know, or if he's guilty of Jewish issues that are not their issues. He appeared before Agrippa, Herod Agrippa II, and his sister. And Herod Agrippa, which Luke seems to view as also being fair, Agrippa, what's his conclusion? After Paul preaches his last sermon in Acts.
He didn't do anything about it.
Didn't do anything. And Agrippa knows. He may not be ethnically Jewish, but the conversation starts with, you're a guy who knows. You're a guy who knows the Jewish law and Jewish customs. Here's what I believe. Am I guilty of anything Jewish? Violating anything related to Jewish law or traditions? And Agrippa says, no. This guy should be turned loose. You know, he is innocent. And Festus, who is the governor, says, I agree. But what has Paul done?
He's asked to see Caesar.
I want my case tried before Caesar because I am a Roman citizen. I am a good Jew because that's what he's been pounding on in these conversations. Again, I think Luke is the most Jewish of the evangelists, and he's writing to a congregation that internally has a lot of values Judaism. Or he wouldn't be making such a definitive focus. That Paul is, Paul never denies that he's Jewish. In fact, that was the trumped up charges, that he was telling Christians they didn't need to be, telling Jewish Christians they could stop being Jews. And Paul says, I haven't done that. I'm not doing that. And we know, because Luke tells us he hasn't been doing it. So he is going to Rome. If he gets to Rome, now the gospel can what? Be completed. Acts can be a completed work. The word can go to the ends of the earth. So now he's heading to Rome. As we enter chapter 27, what do they decide to do?
Sail for Rome.
They're going to sail for Rome. Now, we've seen this happen 2 other times. Something kind of subtle has happened here. How does the narrative change?
Isn't it? Who is writing this?
Now he's shifted to first person again. Remember, we've seen it 2 other times that he shifted to first person. Now, could be a lot of reasons why the writer shifts, from third person to first person. Could be that he is the one, the writer is the actual one who's doing this, involved in this. Could be. Problem is, this would mean this was written very early. This would have been maybe even earlier than Mark, and there's a lot pointing away from that. But that could be, you have no way of knowing. Could be that he's using it for emphasis. That the writer wants to emphasize, this is really important, so I'm not just giving you third person information. I'm telling you something, I'm writing it as though it's first person, because this is really important for you to know. Maybe. Could be one of the things, and I'm kind of tilting towards this more than I had in the past. One of the things that's, I think, important for us always to remember is that these evangelists are working with piles of stories, or put together stories. They aren't reporters following behind, writing notes. They're organizing a lot of things that are being shared. Okay, she's getting a drink. That's good. They're organizing a lot of things. Now, I think it's personally, I think it's likely that when he's working with this, it's the story he's working with has been communicated to him first person. And he believes Luke, the writer, who is writing this, 30, 40 years after this has happened. He believes this is really important, so he's going to keep it in first person because that's how he received it. I kind of tilt in that direction now, more than he's just using it as a stylistic device to emphasize, for emphasis, because I don't know why he would be doing it. I would think he would do it in other areas that are more theologically important than the places he's done it. Doesn't seem to have a lot of import. This doesn't seem theologically that important when compared to other things, like the Apostolic Council, where they make these huge decisions. That's a big deal, to say I was there. This maybe, but if it is, I don't understand, what's going on in his head. And since he can't be interviewed, you don't know. But anyway, he does shift to first person, and he's going to carry first person for a while, not forever. He'll shift back into third, but now he's in first person, so it becomes we, instead of they. Okay. All right. So they're going to Italy. What do they do? What information does Luke give us as they're getting ready to go to Italy?
We're out of the prisoner.
Okay, what's that?
He's not the only
He's not the only one going to Rome. What else? What other information does Luke give us? Because he gives us a lot of information here, right?
about the weather being so bad.
Yeah, well, he talks about the weather, he talks about the ship, he talks about the one who's in charge of him, the proconsul that's responsible, even where the ship is from. So it's a lot of detail here about this trip. And so they kind of take off, right? And as he describes Paul's treatment on this ship, how does he describe the way the Romans are treating Paul? Because
Julius the centurion took a liking to him and gave him liberty to go to his friends and to receive from them.
okay, so what is Luke, again, this is a message Luke is conveying to his church. What is he telling his church?
He has a lot of freedom.
Yeah, Paul has a lot of freedom,
He's
right?
not alone.
Yeah, not alone.
The Romans.
Romans aren't bad guys.
Right.
They ain't Christian, but they're not bad. So anyway, so they start their trip, right? Okay. And Paul gets transferred onto another ship, right? Because the ship they're on, now understand, these are ancient ships. And when you were sailing, you wanted to stay as close to shore as you could, because it was really dangerous to go out. Remember when we first started this whole series with Genesis, do you remember in Genesis 1, what was at the beginning, before God spoke? As the writer of Genesis, in Genesis 1,
Water.
right, water. Because before God even speaks, there's water, right? And we talked about it a little bit, and we've seen it alluded to in other places. Why was there water? What did water mean to these ancient people?
Chaos.
Water meant chaos. Water meant chaos to ancient people. And that's why in creation, God creates a bubble in the water. Because there's water above, and there's water below, and there's water around. But God creates a bubble of order within the chaos. And that's why at the flood, God does what? Releases the chaos. He removes the boundaries, and chaos reasserts itself. So water is this symbol of chaos. When Jesus walks on water, symbolically, that's really powerful, because he's walking on chaos. It's not just he knew the stones, where to step. This is the evangelists, all three of them, telling us that Jesus had power over chaos. When he stills a storm, that's important, because that's chaos. Man, that's the way ancient people looked at the water. They looked at the Mediterranean Sea, and ships went out and sometimes didn't come back. And that's why they create all these stories about what's living in the water, what's living out there in the sea. Leviathan lives. And what is Leviathan? In the Living Bible, it says crocodile, but it wasn't crocodile. What was a Leviathan? It was a sea monster. There were monsters out there. You get in your ship, you go out there are monsters. Behemoth is living out there. That's why in Job, when it talks about, God created Leviathan and Behemoth, and they play in his sight. Lord have mercy. These monsters that sailors are afraid of. They're pets. God treats them like pets. That's a powerful message. But that's the way ancient people saw, because the sea is not controllable. You can control the land. You can plant on the land. But you can't control the water. And so when sailors, you wanted to stay as close to land as possible. And here they're going close to land, right? Until they transfer Paul into another ship, right? And you remember in it what was the ship? It's a ship going to Rome, going to Italy, right? And you remember from where it came?
Egypt.
Came from Egypt. Why would a ship be coming from Egypt to Italy? We find out later in the story what the ship is doing.
It's carrying grain.
It's carrying grain. Because Egypt was the place that was the bread basket of the empire. The Nile Valley is where they had produced grain. And so Rome shipped grain in to feed the population. So it was a transport ship. So Paul is being transported onto that. Where do they end up, this little ship, initially? Because Paul gives a lot of locations. Luke gives a lot of locations. They're transferred because they're following the coast. They get transferred to another ship, right? And the ship starts heading into the Mediterranean Sea. If you look at a map, if they were going to follow the coast all the way to Rome, it's going to take them forever, because you're going around two peninsulas. It is going to take you forever. So somewhere down the line, you're going to have to go across the Mediterranean Sea, and that's scary. That is scary. I remember when I was a boy and growing up in Norfolk, and the first time we drove to the Delmarva Peninsula, because you have Norfolk and then the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, and on the other side is Virginia and then Maryland and Delaware. And we were going to Philadelphia, and Dad decided to go over the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel. And it's got two tunnels. Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel is two. And as we were going across, we went through the one tunnel, which is no big deal, because we went over through tunnels all the time. There were tunnels all over the place around Norfolk, because you're always going underneath rivers. So going through the tunnel wasn't a big deal. What was a big deal when I was a little boy is when you were in that area between the tunnels, you didn't see anything but water. There was nothing but water. And I'll tell you, and two lanes, because the bridge was two lanes, and it had little railings, but two lanes. Nothing in front of you, nothing behind you, nothing to the side but water. That was it. And I'll tell you, it made you a little shaky. We did it once when it was snowing. Made you a little shaky. Made you a little shaky. Nobody else was on it because it was snowing. Made you a little shaky because you're surrounded by water. That's what they're looking at doing. They're looking at striking across the sea. Now, where do they end up? So they're starting to go. He's been transferred with the other prisoners to this merchant ship that's taking grain from Egypt to Italy. They strike out across the Mediterranean. They stop at what island? What island do they?
Crete.
They go to the island. They get to the island of Crete. And if you look at a map, that's where they're heading. They're heading west, and they stop at Crete. Now, and again, a lot of detail. Luke gives us a lot of detail about cities and stuff. What happens around Crete? So they get to Crete.
Hurricane.
Okay, you got weather issues. What time of year do they get to Crete?
It must be coming winter.
Okay,
They said they couldn't, the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, that's why they continued on.
Okay, if you notice in verse 9, it talks about the fast had already gone by. You know what the fast they're talking about, Luke is talking about, is Yom Kippur. So we're talking about mid-October. So they are around Crete mid-October, which means winter's coming. And evidently in the Mediterranean, and they seem to know it, what happens in the Mediterranean during the winter?
Must be storms.
Must be storms. There must be storms. And so, but they're in Crete, and they're in a place called Fairhaven. Good gracious, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. But you can't stay there. Because remember, it's a ship full of grain, right?
Yeah.
Now, Paul suggests they do what?
They weather out the storm there.
Okay, what he's saying is, let's stay here until spring. He's not talking about let's stay here for the weekend and see if things clear up. He's saying let's spend the winter here, so we're not going across the Mediterranean in the middle of winter when storms kick up. Let's stay here, which is what sailors did, because that's unknown. You're moving into an area that's pretty much unknown. There's all kinds of stuff out there. Let's wait until the weather's better. But who says, no, we got to push on?
The centurion.
The centurion says, and
The pilot.
yeah, why would the pilot? The centurion says we got to push on because I got prisoners that need to be delivered. And the longer I stay here on shore, the more chance the prisoners have of leaving, of running away. Why would the pilot of the ship say, oh, we can make it?
He probably gets paid.
Yeah.
So does his grains.
Yeah, the worst thing that's going to happen to him is if he's sitting in there for 3-4 months with a shipload of grain. He ain't making any money, Grain may not be any good by the time he gets there. So he's got financial reasons for going. Now Luke drops this in. As the reader, he wouldn't drop it in unless something's going to happen later. So anyway, but they end up trying to take off. And they kind of decide to compromise. Instead of striking off in the ocean, what do they decide to do? So it appears that maybe Paul was more persuasive than we might initially think. Because what does it appear as though everybody agrees that they'll do?
They're hugging the land, they're hugging the...
Yeah, they're going down the Crete, the shore of Crete, and they're trying to make it to a harbor called Phoenix, which evidently is a good harbor. And harbors are nice during storms for ships because the water isn't as deep and, it's just protected. So they're gonna winter in Phoenix and be safe, but what happens?
So a gentle south wind began to blow.
Okay.
So they thought they'd take off.
Yeah, so we'll make it. Because south wind, looking at where they're going, when you say a south wind, that means it's coming from the south, right? It's not blowing south, it's coming from the south. That means the wind is pushing them towards Crete. Well, as they go along Crete, the wind is helping them. So they're making good time until they're not, because what kicks up? A nor'easter. Which means if the wind is blowing from the north and from the east, that means the wind is pushing them in what direction? South and west. If it's coming from the northeast, boom, it's pushing them out. Which means it's pushing them where?
Back toward Jerusalem.
It's pushing them into the middle of the Mediterranean Sea.
Okay. Yeah.
It is pushing them out into the scary part. In fact, a little later they'll talk about Syrtis. And Syrtis, that they were afraid that they were going to be pushed all the way to Syrtis. Syrtis is in North Africa. That's the little bay around Libya, in North Africa. So if they get pushed down there, they are way off course. They're in big trouble if the wind pushes them all the way there.
It just amazes me how, all those years ago, how they knew where the land was and how large the Mediterranean Sea was. Somebody's been out in it to make these maps, and that they knew like where Crete was. And
these sailors are pretty amazing in what they could do. But there's no GPS.
No.
Yeah, when they are out there, they are out there, and that's why you have sea monsters out there, because sometimes people go and don't come back.
And don't come back.
Yeah, and something took them, and so little communities come up with reasons. So what's that? Stories, yeah, stories, and that kind of, it might be appropriate to mention here the power of story. I think I mentioned it once before. One of the things we see when we look at ancient writings is they didn't hesitate, even Christian writers, didn't hesitate telling good stories. You know, there was no hesitation about telling a story about an adventure, you know, where the apostles saved damsels in distress, or fight, you know, Thomas fought a dragon. You know, they had no trouble telling these stories. Now, the stories weren't true, but they still told them, and why would they tell them?
Make life interesting.
You make life interesting. Alan, you're thinking about being a Christian? Let me tell you about this Christian that slay a dragon. Whoa! You know, that's what they did. There's all kinds of stories circulating, you know, about adventures, because an adventure keeps your interest. You know, preaching a sermon, Lord have mercy, who wants to listen to a long sermon? There was a pause. Much better to talk about being on the sea in the midst of a storm. That I'll listen to. When you start preaching again, let me know. You know, let me know. Anyway, so they get pushed, right? You know, and they are now in, what's that situation?
Dire.
They are in, their situation is dire, right? And what are some of the things Luke tells us that remind us that their situation is dire?
They didn't get to eat for several days.
They didn't get to eat for 14 days, for crying out loud. Understand though, it's a boat full of grain, you know, so it's not like they're not away. They got a lot of grain on that boat, you know, so they hadn't dumped the cargo yet, you know, so but they're, you know, they're in the midst of the storm, they're not eating, they're scary. In fact, the sun, they don't even see the sun. It's dark, you know, because of the storm. Well, you know, symbolically that becomes good. There's no light there. So they are in a bad situation. Now we, the reader, though, as we read this, and Luke is really good at shaping this story. It's kind of exciting. But as we read it, what do we know? What do we know as we read this story? Oh my gosh, Paul is in big trouble. He's in the midst of a storm. The northeast.
You're going to be losing hope.
Oh, they're losing hope. They're in big trouble. They're hungry. The sky is dark. It's stirred up. But we, the reader, know what? He's going to make it to Rome.
Right.
You know, we know that. We know he's making it to Rome. But in the story, really bad. Now, they've been out there a long time, right? Who, of course, steps forward? Paul steps forward, right? And he reminds them they hadn't been with food a long time. And what does he say? And I think this is very good, realistic. What's the first thing he said?
I told you so.
I told you so, only he said it in Greek, which makes it sound better. But that's the first thing he said, you know, is, I told you so. Which, again, becomes a little bit important because it shows what about Paul? He's perceptive, he has insight. Now, it's interesting because he doesn't say in Crete, God is with us, let us go. You know, I need to go to Rome, let us go, God will protect me. Doesn't say that. He says, I've heard about the storms on the Mediterranean Sea, we need to winter here. You know, but and it's really not even their fault because they were going to a safe harbor. They were blown. You know, they didn't choose that. But anyway, Paul says, after he says, I told you so, which Luke is also telling his church, Paul knew. Then what does he tell them? What does he tell them to do?
Keep up your courage.
Keep up your courage. Why should you have courage?
Because not one of you will be lost.
Now, one of you, how does Paul know that?
An angel of God.
An angel of God tells him, right? And what did the angel say?
Don't be afraid. You have to stand trial.
Mm-hmm. You are going to make it to Rome. you are going to make it to Rome. And how should this then affect the crew? As Paul is still talking to him, knowing that Paul saw this angel saying, you're going to appear before the emperor, because, I can imagine the crew would be saying, that's good news to you, but what does that have to do with us? What does Paul suggest that should do for the crew?
They're gonna stay alive.
Okay, they're going to stay alive. Because if God's going to save me, God's going to save all of you. God's going to save all of you. Now, 14 nights, dark sky, no food, drifting around, wind blowing. What happens on the 14th night?
It says that they're drawing near land.
Okay, the sailors think they're getting close to land. How do they know? Again, Luke gives us all this information. How do they know they're getting close to land?
Because the water's getting more shallow.
Okay, the water's getting shallow. Now you got a new fear, right?
Rocks.
And what's the new fear? Rocks around the shore, right?
Rocks.
And why is that going to be a problem?
It'll destroy the ship.
Destroy the ship, And so the sailors, the ones who know this, they decide they're going to do what?
Escape.
They're going to abandon ship, right? Mm-hmm. The sailors are going to abandon ship, and what do they do? How do they try to abandon ship?
They pretend they're doing something else.
Yeah, okay, and they drop the lifeboats. They drop boats, right? And they're going to get in those boats, and they're going to go to shore, because they know they're close to land. And they're going to go to shore. And what does Paul say?
If they leave, nobody else will be saved.
If they leave, we are all lost. And what does the Roman centurion do?
Cut the ropes.
He cuts the ropes. The sailors drop the boats, or dropping the boats into the water, and the centurion cuts the ropes. So where are the sailors?
Stuck on the boat.
They're in the big boat. They can't leave. He has cut off the only way they can escape. Which shows what about the centurion?
He's believing.
He believes what Paul says. So again, the Romans are not the bad guys. They'll listen to you if you make sense. What happens before daybreak? Daybreak. Ooh, symbolic. Oh, what a wonderful time for things to happen. What happens before daybreak?
They all eat.
But who convinces them to eat? Paul, which it now looks as though Paul is what?
In charge.
In charge. He says, now's the time boys, now's the time to eat. You hadn't eaten anything. And now's the time to eat, because you need to be strong. You being hungry isn't going to help you. You need to get your strength back, and I promise you what?
No one will lose a single hair.
Not a hair is going to be taken. You're not going to lose a single hair. Which I wish he had said to me sometime about 30 years ago. That would have been considered really good news, but it didn't happen. And so Paul says, boys, let's have dinner, because we got a big day tomorrow. After sunrise, we got a big day coming up. And as they're sharing the dinner, Luke tells us they did what? What happens?
Threw all the wheat into the sea.
Well,
It sounds like they had communion.
it sounds like communion, right? After saying that, he took the bread and thanked God, and he
Gave it to them.
broke it and gave it to them. Now, as we read that sounds like communion, right? Mm-hmm. Sure, it sounds like and I don't think it's accidental, because Luke he's the one that's writing it, mm-hmm. And he's certainly he's writing it like it's communion, right? One of the interesting things, though, when you look at how Luke and when Luke has done this before, he did this once before. And I'm not talking about when Jesus had his meal with his disciples. After Jesus rose again on the Emmaus Road, he's walking with these two guys, right? And they don't recognize him. they're telling what happened, and Jesus then opens up scripture and starts teaching, which is a big deal in Luke. Teaching is a big deal in Luke. And they get to a place, and Jesus is going, and they say, no, wait with us, we won't, so we can talk more. And Jesus stops, and they're at table, and it says, and this is in the 24th chapter of Luke, he takes the bread, and he breaks it. Jesus breaks it, and what happens to those two guys? They recognize him. They recognize him. And all of a sudden, he disappears. He's gone. Which becomes a powerful lesson that Luke is teaching his church. If you want to feel the presence of God, how do you do it? You break the bread. You break the bread. That's when God is present. That's when Jesus is present with you. And Paul is doing the exact same thing here. I think really significant, even more so when you remember how Luke has presented communion, the breaking of the bread. This is where we recognize the presence of Christ, which he's already established. Okay, so he does that. How do they feel as a result of this?
Encouraged.
They are encouraged. So it's successful, right? Now that they have eaten, and Paul has broken the bread, which means sort of recognize the presence of God is there, because that's how you do it. What do now that they've been fed?
You throw the wheat.
They throw the wheat off. They dump the wheat into the sea. And you're thinking, geez Louise, why would they be dumping the wheat into the sea? Why didn't they do it when they were, in the middle of in the Mediterranean?
They haven't lightened the load. Were they afraid of the rocks?
Yeah. They're preparing for land, because they're going to run the boat aground. And the lighter the boat is, the closer they're going to get to the shore. So they are preparing to disembark. And the grain in the boat gives the boat a little more ballast. So when the sea is so rough, the boat being a little bit heavier lies a little bit lower instead of on top, so it's less susceptible to winds and storms. So they are ready for land. And what do they see in the morning? Land is there. They see the land, which means that Paul was right. Everything Paul told them to do was right. And they are preparing to run the boat ashore, so they don't need anchors because they're going to run it on shore. So they're getting rid of anything that's going to weigh the boat down. They want the boat to be as light as possible. And one of the ways to make the boat as light as possible is to do what?
Stuff overboard.
You throw stuff overboard. Okay? So they're throwing stuff overboard. What is a potential problem when they hit the shore? And you could do and lighten the load.
Jump over yourself.
Well, remember who's on the boat?
The president.
Prisoners. Now, if we
Throw the president.
throw the prisoners overboard, we lighten things up a little bit, right? We also don't run the risk of getting to shore and the prisoners doing what? Running away, which prisoners tend to do. So the soldiers are ready, and they're going to get in trouble if the prisoners escape. If they kill the prisoners before they hit the shore, nobody's going to blame them, because that makes sense. That's what they should do. But who steps?
Well, the centurion.
Somebody's purse is on the floor.
Is she going to
Got
go?
Kleenex chewing it up.
Oh, is your purse down?
Here, what?
Oh,
Come here.
she's got some Kleenex.
Yes, she did. Oh, we'll help you out.
It's all good.
How did you get there?
So far, it's just a tissue.
Coco, come here.
Doesn't take
Come
very
here.
much of it.
Come here.
What's going on? Did you find something?
I am sorry.
All right, don't get your head.
All right, but
For sure.
I am
The taller you
sorry.
are, the harder it is to get off.
I bet it is.
I hope it wasn't like $100 bill.
It was clean.
It was clean
That
out.
was just a tissue.
Okay.
2 years.
Coco,
Yeah, just ignoring it before.
Lord have mercy.
It's very hard to not do that for animals.
Well, and sometimes that's why, when I leave on Wednesday, I think maybe I should leave her at home.
It was that much and she got it, she got it out. It's always open. It doesn't
But-
take much.
All right, so, but we're almost there, right? Who steps forward? The centurion, and the centurion does what?
He told those that could swim to jump.
Okay, first he tells the soldiers, don't kill the prisoners.
Right.
Don't kill the prisoners. And if you can swim,
Go for it.
go, go for it. Only he said it in Latin, which makes it sound better. Every man for himself, kind of like that. Go for it. And if you can't swim,
Take wood.
Find a way.
yeah, look, this boat's going to break up. This boat's going to break up. There's going to be plenty of wood and stuff that you can float on. So now they're on an unnamed island, right?
Malta.
That's where it'll be. They're going to be in Malta, and you look at a map, Malta's right there in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. It's right there, but close, not far from Italy, but still in the middle of the sea. So they aren't safely home. And they've got what? No boat, because the boat has broken up, because one of the problems when the boat stops, the waves don't. And that's a lot of pressure on a boat, with the waves crashing onto a wooden hull, and so it breaks up.
But they must have, for all that wind, they traveled in a pretty straight line from Crete to Malta.
Yeah,
So someone was with them
yes.
14 days.
They did, and it does
My
say,
map shows they're Crete and then they go south and then they go.
Oh, okay.
well, who knows where they're going?
Yeah.
But they do.
Yeah, I was just looking here,
But I think that's a good point, and I think that's I believe that may be something Luke is suggesting. How they get
Because they could have
there.
ended up in Africa,
Right, which
going
and
south.
Luke even introduces that they're heading too far south because the wind is blowing from the northeast, so it could blow them to the coast of Africa. It's really miraculous that they make it, because 14 days in the middle of a storm in a little wooden boat.
And how do you have any strength? Like, you're weak after 14 days
know.
of
Yeah.
not eating.
That's right. And I think Luke kind of wants us to feel as though God has a hand on this, because we know that, and Paul reminded us of that after 14 days, because that's what the angel said. The angel didn't say, "Oh, I'm going to keep you safe because you're great guys, and I'm going to keep you safe." He says, "I'm going to keep you safe because you're going to appear. You're going to go to Rome. You're going to appear before the emperor," and that's the focus. This boat's going to make it, or you're going to make it to Rome. Now the boat won't make it, because the boat is pretty much what? History now. That's done. And now Paul is on shore of an unnamed island, and we've got one more chapter to go before, and the question is now,
Does he make it to Rome?
will he make it? Will Paul make it? On YouTube, I will, when I just have bits and pieces of time, they show these little shorts that are like 2 minutes, sometimes like 30 seconds, sometimes 2 minutes, these little tiny shorts. And for some reason, and I don't know why they do it, if you watch one thing, then you see a lot of them. And one of the things, I guess I watched it once because I get them now every day, these little shorts, and it's like 30 seconds to 2 minutes, from the old Batman series from 1964. These little tiny shorts from the old Batman. And you remember in Batman, I was a little boy when Batman was on, and I watched it for those 2 years, Wednesdays and Thursdays. Boom.
We would run home, we had kids choir practice, and we'd run home from kids choir practice to watch Batman.
7:30. I'll tell you, it destroyed
I remember that.
it destroyed the Munsters, because the Munsters were on Thursday night at 7:30, and they did fine ratings wise until the second part of Batman on ABC, because Munsters were on CBS. They were on ABC, and that's what people watch. That's what kids watch. So, but I did. And you remember on Wednesday, and when they went to one show a week, it wasn't the same. But when it was two on Wednesday and Thursday, at the end of the Wednesday show, you remember?
It was a preview for Thursday.
Well, Batman and Robin were always
In trouble.
in trouble. About to be eaten by a clam, sinking in a giant cake. Something bad was going to happen, right? And you'd have to tune in on Thursday.
Same bad time.
Same bat time, same bat channel. And you got to see. And this is what we're here now. Paul is on this island. He's going to get it, but we don't know how he's going to do it. So we got to tune in to chapter 29 next week this time. Same.
Was this?
Chapter 28.
What year was this? You're
Batman,
talking Batman.
1964.
Oh.
1964,
I know I
65.
had to watch it because my brothers watched it.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
Oh,
Batman being a.
But did you like it?
Batman.
Did you like it though?
Oh,
Yeah.
we played Batman on the playground. Batman and Rob, we all had our favorite villains. Oh, that was good stuff. And then it kind of faded, 2 years, and then it was kind of run its
I'm
course.
very old when that was on. You're not as old as I am. I'd have been 9.
I was 7. I was 7. 64.
Yeah, we can relate to that.
Taking babies out.
Oh, well, clearly you didn't have a 6, 7, 8-year-old boy hanging around, because if you did, Batman would have been on. Dad loved Batman.
And now you see, like, they put reruns of Batman late at night.
Yeah,
Is it that on the weekends or something? I'm just,
on MeTV.
and
you
it's
can-
so they're so silly.
It is. Well, particularly when you compare it to the Batman movies now, which are very dramatic and serious and dark, but everything was a bat,
But that's what held kids' attention
Yeah.
back then.
his bat tires and bat.
Boys will sit still for a half hour.
There you go.
It was good stuff. Okay, let's have a word of prayer and then go home. Lord God, thank you so much for giving us this time together, and remind us that even when it's hard to see your presence, you are never far away from us. You really aren't. And you've given us ways to recognize your presence. And one of those ways is when we gather together and break the bread. So help us to see your presence in those things that we do. And then help us to step forward with faith to do what you have called and equipped us to do. We ask this in the name of Christ. Amen. So thank you.